Welcome. Thank you so much for coming this evening. We are going to be having a conversation this evening that actually started several months ago when this art became something that I first was exposed to, and obviously David and Nancy had been exposed to it long before I had, but I was taken by the art when I first saw it and saw immediately the mythic energy that was contained within the art. I believe that art is meant to communicate something where words fall short. And oftentimes the image, in what we call in the mythological community, the mythic image, is meant to speak to a part of our soul that we don't necessarily have access to through other mediums. This was the experience that I had when I first began to look at Burton's work and look at the stories he was telling, the ideas he was presenting, and the questions he seemed to be asking in his work as well. When it comes to myth and art, we're talking about a human endeavor that has existed for thousands and thousands of years. We think back to the cave paintings and the stories that seem to be appearing in the first times that human beings are attempting to express what their day-to-day lives were like in some sort of visual way. But the very first images that we ever saw mythologically included images of animals and a shaman. And I always think of that image of the shaman inside some of those early cave paintings as being the artist theirself. I don't think it's a far stretch to say that Burton was a shaman and that the shamanistic work that Burton created is something that people will be reckoning with for some time. Now, we're going to learn a little bit tonight about the history of how some of this work came to be, and a little bit about the meaning behind some of the processes and things of that nature. But I want to conclude my thoughts here before I invite our other panelists to speak to their involvement in Burton's work and in our evening tonight. I want to conclude by talking for just a moment about why this is such an important fit for the Philosophical Research Society. My name is John Bucher, and I have the honor of serving as the executive director of the Joseph Campbell Foundation, and I'm also on the board of the Philosophical Research Society, so I spend a lot of my life digging into the mysteries of what is happening in consciousness. And there's something that is in the essence and energy of Burton's work that also swims in those same waters, asks so many of those same questions. Here at the Philosophical Research Society, Manly Hall was very interested in many of the ideas that transcended the mainstream thought when it came to spirituality, when it came to consciousness, when it came to ways that human beings reach beyond themselves and the traditions and the rituals that they were involved in. But Manly Hall was also tremendously interested in visual images and symbols from around the world and how those visual images and symbols communicated to us and created an invitation for us to spiritually interact with ideas bigger than ourselves. If you haven't had an opportunity, when we're finished with our conversation here tonight, I really hope that you'll join us over in the gallery to experience Burton's work for yourself if you've not had a chance to do so. There's something quite mystical, there's something quite magical, and there's something quite wondrous about just being in the same physical space that Burton touched that canvas and created that work out of nothing that is still speaking to us today after he's gone. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give a brief introduction of who they are and how they're connected to this work. And Nancy, we'll save you for last, so I'll ask David to begin next.
My name's David Orr. I'm an artist, and I was giving a talk at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. I had done a series of skulls, images of skulls that I had photographed there. And so for the opening, I did a series of talks. And I was beginning to familiarize myself with symbology, and I was kind of realizing I needed to learn more. And after I gave the talk, someone came up to me and said, "You've clearly read The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly Hall." And I was like, I had not read that book. So I availed myself of it. And I was beyond excited because, many artists I admired had explored symbols. A very popular example, an artist that continues to have a lot of reach is Jean-Michel Basquiat. But obviously many others as well. I was less aware of the spiritual tradition of art, setting aside the early religious works. But yeah, I was primarily interested in contemporary art and abstract art, and I didn't realize that there was a spiritual undercurrent there. Obviously Morris Tuckman's exhibit took care of that. Anyway, to my wild surprise, I learned that this place was still open and available to visit, and I began to visit every Friday during the opening hours. And then I began to work on a series of works based on the texts here, which I ended up showing. And then I ended up starting the Hansel Gallery and establishing the Contemporary Arts program. But it really came from the excitement of finding a place that is a source for all these different traditions. You're not reading about a sutra, you're looking at a sutra. You're not looking, you're not hearing about something Zoroastrian, you're looking at something Zoroastrian. And that's a really powerful feeling, and it's in line with what Manly Hall was trying to do with this space and why he was adopted by the New Age movement and a lot of other progressives, and that he was trying to create an environment where you could come and learn for yourself and decide for yourself at a time when that wasn't necessarily the most popular way of approaching the subject. And obviously the second you start to do that, that's where mythology kicks in. Jung used the library here as a resource when he was researching, particularly his studies of alchemy. And many people cross the threshold. I'll just name a few real quick, but Euston Smith, I'm going to blank, of course. Gene Roddenberry, some of the ideas in Star Trek came from this building. Charles Bukowski was married in the library. There's a lot of different people that crossed the paths with this place and were really enormously influenced by it and have used it as a resource. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nancy because Burton used this place as a resource.
And yeah, he certainly did. I have been Burton's curator and archivist for many years, and designed this show not just as an exploration of his work in mythology and the mythology of how he approaches his work, but also as a celebration of what would have been his 100th birthday. So he was born on April 29th, 1924, and those of you who were able to make it to the opening actually got birthday cake. So, and so what I can bring to our little group here is this sort of our hero's journey. I kind of think of myself as the one who's telling the story of how he got to whatever these points are that we're going to be discussing. And maybe I'll just start with just a brief outline of his early years and how he came to this point where this is what I want to do, to be an artist. So he was born in Brooklyn to Jewish immigrant parents and was an avid reader and a troublemaker, but relentlessly curious. But it wasn't until high school that he discovered art. I'm just going to put up a sort of Burton at that time. But his parents really just forbade him to actually do anything about art. He started reading about the lives of artists and became very curious and interested, started frequenting the museums of New York, and loved to tell the story of one day at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I've heard this back from other friends too, that after, just loved seeing everything that was there and filling his eyes. But there was a moment that changed everything when he saw a certain shade of blue. I wrote this down, and now I don't know where it is. Sorry. He saw a certain shade of blue in a Titian sing to him from across the room. So it was this shade of lapis lazuli. And I don't know if it was this Titian, but this is a Titian from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But it's likely that it was something very like this. But that shade of blue just did something to the way he thought about the world at that moment, at the age of 15. And the gods, if we think about our hero's journey, were they calling to him at this moment? But again, because his parents forbade any kind of movement in that direction, when he graduated high school, he was drafted into World War II, where he served in the Philippines, was wounded, got a Purple Heart, and after spending a little time in a hospital in San Francisco, was sent back to New York, where he studied at NYU on the GI Bill, mostly philosophy and literature, was married, and then upon graduating, his family had moved out to Los Angeles, so he and his wife did as well, and he spent some time working in the family business, and that wasn't working so well, so he started working in some other businesses, and that wasn't really what he wanted to do, so he started sort of moving to job after job, sort of traveling back and forth across the country. And then after a trip to Mexico, back to Los Angeles in 1958, he decided, I am going to become an artist. And that's what I'm going to do. And after a time, his wife divorced him, but during that time, for the next 10 to 12 years, he spent, again, moving from New York to San Francisco to Los Angeles, Mexico. I think he spent time in Arizona and New Mexico, just learning his craft and keeping odd jobs so that he could kind of keep it all together, studying and filling his eyes, and studying at places like the Philosophical Research Society, Theosophical Society. He spent the time there because he saw that the turn-of-the-century artists were very interested in Theosophy. So he wanted to know more about what they wanted to know. And he studied all of those things very deeply.
Well, I think we have our hero's journey call to adventure, and we have our crossing of the first threshold here into the arts. So, the artist then wanders out into the forest or into the road of trials, as Joseph Campbell might say. So I feel like a lot of what we experience in certain pieces feels like an inner road of trials that Burton was journeying through. And I wonder if maybe let's get to more of Burton's art itself.
Yeah.
David, feel free to select one of the early works, and let's discuss
There's
that.
something in the first sort of line on your.
All right, let's take a look.
So this is a piece that each one of these pieces we've had a great deal of discussion around, and the mythological aspects of these pieces vary from tradition to tradition. When I first saw this piece, and then I'd love to invite the two of you into your thoughts. The first thing my eye is drawn to here is the larger bright colors of the yellow and the red, surrounded by the blue, but immediately I'm drawn to what else is happening outside this giant circle. It feels like a very mythological expression to me that Burton might have seen himself as being someone outside that big bright circle, that the idea of the outsider, the idea of someone who feels othered in culture, that they're maybe not part of what is happening in the mainstream, is something that is communicated to me in this piece. I also feel like there are pieces of African mythology that come through, especially in the designs around each of the sides. The use of the colors and the shapes and the patterns, there's a certain kente cloth feel to some of those things which pull us to the most ancient civilizations on the earth, while our circle here in the center feels very much part of the modern art movement. So I feel like we have modern art being surrounded by this more ancient art. In a sense, when I first saw this, I felt like this is a bit of a self-portrait of Burton's, because we see someone who is living in a much later era, who's in this modern art world, and yet is surrounded by the ancient thinking, the ancient myths, the ancient thoughts. So what comes up for the two of you as you experience this piece?
Well, certainly Burton knew all the things that you're talking about, and it's entirely possible that was all in the back of his mind. But it could have. But there's also that portion that's just him enjoying the use of color. He always referred to himself as a colorist, and the way that he just loved to put the colors together. So I see this, and the piece is not that big. It's only like this, and it's mind blowing just to think of doing that, let alone what's really there.
What about you, David?
Well, I think it's an interesting piece because there's, as you said, there's two dialogues going on at once. I mean, there's many dialogues going on, but it feels like there's two primary ones. And when I think of Burton looking to the past to inform the future, I think of what Bob Dylan wrote in his in Chronicles, where he was reading Thucydides when he was writing stuff like The Times They Are A-Changing, and Civil War accounts of battles and politics to inform what he was writing in the 60s. He was reading things from the 1860s, and his rationale was, these are the themes that are as old as we are. Yeah. That's not going to change. And I think that's part of the reason those songs resonated so much. Yeah. They were obviously a contemporary setting and a contemporary time, and they spoke to that time, but it was also looking back to inform it. And I think any good artist does. Yeah. And sometimes it can be hard to recognize that they've gone back and picked something up. This particular image obviously does a very good job of that. And I wanted to just digress for just a second and just tell the audience also, Burton worked for about 60 years as an artist and showed once at the very, very, very end of his life. This was a guy who went through at least 8 different periods that I can count, you can correct me on that, all very, very different, all very accomplished, and yet didn't show almost at all. I curated him in his first group show, I believe, in 2015, 2016. Anyway,
Yes.
along,
17?
yeah. So, I mean, he did not show a lot, which as an artist terrifies me because, part of a work's life is the dialogue that you have with the viewer. But it's important to note that he was a peripatetic guy who he didn't live in one place super long, like he hopped around a lot. He didn't stick with one style. I mean, he would work through it, but then he was off to the next thing. And you get the sense that it's a seeker at work, for sure.
And certainly during that early part of his career where he was trying to teach himself to paint, he was just bringing everything together and trying everything and moving, like you said, looking for more inspirations and more libraries and more museums.
And speaking of those inspirations, Nancy, could we go to slide 35 for a minute? This is a picture that, David, I think you took inside of Burton's library. And it's very clear that Burton was quite interested in the work of Carl Jung. And we see he's got all the greatest hits here
And more
of Jung's work. What's interesting to me is we see these books on his shelf in his library. Nancy, then if we could go to slide 10. This piece, to me, feels like it could have been a cousin of the Jung's Red Book, an image that we might find inside of Jung's Red Book. There's a mandala feel that's going on here. There's something that marries Eastern and Western mythology in that we have these flowers, these colors, these images from Eastern mythology, from the Buddhist tradition, and yet we also have what appears to be perhaps a Christ-like figure in a cross in the center here that is a marrying of Eastern and Western mythological traditions that I think is quite interesting. And I don't know at what point Burton encountered the work of Jung in his life, but even if he had not read Jung yet at this point, it's very clear that a lot of the ideas that Jung was working with were also things that were coming up in his soul and that he was beginning to wrestle with. So that's what I see. What about the two of you? What comes up for you for this piece?
Well, and the whole Christ-like thing, I hate to say, that's probably a self-portrait.
Interesting. Why do you say that, Nancy?
Because I know what Bert looks like. And there are a few like this, and but I think you were going to tell the story about Gary Goff.
Yeah, I was.
And I think that's fairly contemporary with this
To this,
piece.
okay.
So I'll let you...
So there's a couple things. Another person I just remembered used to speak here quite a bit was Alan Watts. Speaking of Buddhism, here we go with Gary Goff. I agree with you. I see that there as well. And I think that Jung is important because, again, if you believe that truth lies outside our ability to describe it, that's a through line, absolutely. And, obviously he was thinking in terms of archetypes, all kinds at this point. Right. The other thing that, this is how devoted Burton was to his readings. When he was on the beach, or rather, Gary Goff was walking down Venice Beach and looking for some friends, and he saw this guy wearing, work boots, jeans, a shirt, dressed for normal, streetwear on the beach, reading Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. And he was like, wow, check out this guy. And it was Burton. That's the kind of person he was. So
And I do believe that that would have been about the same period that these paintings were happening. And
This looks very Venice Beach.
and Burton never saw the Red Book until just about a year or two before he passed.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Wow.
Wow.
Yes.
I
Although there were some mandalas in the Jung.
I like hearing that, though, because it tells me this was coming up inside of him without having seen the Red Book, which is even more powerful to me. Actually, I was hoping to go to the next image, image 11. This, I'm assuming, is around the same time as the image we just saw. Yeah?
Yes.
So this was, when I scanned through all of Burton's work, this was the first image that really jumped out to me as having strong mythological energy, although I saw so many of them did the more I examined them. We've got something really interesting happening here, again, with the mixing of mythical traditions and mythological traditions. We see a strong Eastern energy, that's coming up here, and I'm reminded actually of some of the images, even from kabuki theater, that this image evokes for me, but also the hand gestures. There's a secret sign language, if you will, in certain Eastern traditions that
mudras.
Yes, exactly, and so we see some of that coming in, but we also see the Roman idea of the hand of destiny with different images, at the end of each finger here, in certain mythological symbols, and these specifically being alchemical symbols that are at the end of each of these. And again, this causes me to say, wow, this Jungian energy that we were talking about, is Jung's very interested in alchemy, and he's relying on PRS for some of that research. And the mandalas we see in the previous energy, there just seems to be a really interesting alchemical inspiration or influence that's happening during this period of his work. The last thing I'll say is I feel like it even transcends those traditions. I just returned from doing some work on Maya mythology down in Tulum, Mexico, and many of the deities, especially the little statues in the Maya tradition, will often have a very similar expression on their face, where the tongue is sticking out and there's sort of a warding off evil type look. So I'm quite taken by how many different mythological traditions are at work in this particular piece. Any last thoughts about this piece before we? I want to get to as many pieces as we can.
Let's move on to another.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Nancy, why don't you select this time something from the next phase of Burton's work?
I'm just going to go to here, I think.
Yeah.
Here we have a piece, and Kopelow often did not title things. He wanted the conversation to start without a title, for the viewer to really have to bring themselves to the piece. But this one does have a title, and it is Portrait of Giordano Bruno. And so I go and I look up who's Giordano Bruno, and then discover that not only he's a real person, a famous person. So Burton didn't title portraits, didn't title them after people, never titled them after famous people. And I'm thinking, well, this is an interesting piece. This is something we have to sort of talk about. And when I showed it to Kelly, Carmina, she immediately said, "Oh, well, that's the green tablet,
The emerald tablet.
the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus." And so then I went back to the library looking for the green tablet of Hermes Trismegistus and trying to read about Giordano Bruno. So and then as I was doing more research on the show, I was trying to date pieces, because he didn't really start to date things until religiously, until the early 70s. So you'll see that some pieces are kind of said 60, 70. I think he went back and dated a whole bunch of things and signed a whole bunch of things when he figured out I should probably do this regularly. So I pulled this piece to try and see if I could find some information on the back of it, maybe to try and date that piece with the big yellow circle, because this has some similar sort of rhythms. And I find out that it is also called a portrait of Giordano Bruno. So here we have two of them, and him saying, this is important to me. So I read about him, and in brief, Bruno was an ordained Catholic priest in the late 1500s during the Inquisition. He was a mathematician, which I think is where we get these numbers refer to that, a philosopher who developed a system to improve memory. He believed in some things that the Catholic Church wasn't too happy about, such as infinite universe, the idea that there might be other Earths out there like ours.
And multiverses.
Yeah, and reincarnation. He was very influenced by Hermes Trismegistus, and the idea that he put forth that the ancient Greeks and Egyptians, their religions were not only similar but precursors to ours, and the things that we believe are the same. So here's all the idea of the archetype.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting, you mentioned, you didn't specifically say the Lascaux caves, but I'm assuming that was part of it.
Yeah, that's the ones, yeah.
And so, the idea that Giordano Bruno was thinking about multiverses is kind of amazing, because when you think about the Lascaux caves, a lot of people felt that those, first of all, it's early art, but people would claim that those artists didn't understand perspective, because there would be different fields of work happening at the same time, and someone more recently advanced the idea that they're actually representing the idea of the multiverse, that all these things are transpiring at the same time. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is the same idea, that the dead, the living, and the yet to be born are all on parallel timelines and can drift between them. And then Giordano Bruno, also to your point earlier, the other thing that's interesting is that he was somebody who blended many different ideas, and belief systems at the same time. One thing that I found when I was researching him was the idea that he had studied Muslim mathematics early on, and part of that was his memory experiment. Part of it was him being very open-minded at the time to blend all these things together, and that apparently got you burned at the stake. I've actually been there at Campo de Fiori, so it wasn't a great time to be bringing that stuff up. Just a last sort of anecdote about this. If you're music fans, you might like the band Eels, and E from Eels, his father was Hugh Everett. Hugh Everett was a quantum physicist who advanced the many worlds theory and was laughed basically out of the profession and died an alcoholic. About 2 years after he passed, Freeman Dyson started realizing he may have been right. This happens a lot in science, more than you might think. That people, the continental drift, people couldn't stop making fun of proponents of that. But I mention this because Giordano Bruno was, branded a heretic for talking about this, hundreds of years ago, and someone else got pilloried in the more modern way of that and sent into exile for thinking the same things. Meanwhile, you're looking at work. If you think of the piece with the very bold circle that you brought up first, and perfect beginning, thank you, John, and this, you can begin to see it's clear there's many influences happening at the same time and being blended together. One of the things that I was really struck by as we were going through these early pieces too is that it's clear that this is somebody who spent a lot of time in museums just looking at stuff. Yeah. Like even if he hadn't begun to read Jung or hadn't begun to do the work in deep dives into alchemy and things like that, he was seeing these forms and obviously reacting to them.
Yeah. Well, in Hermes Trismegistus was considered the father of alchemy. The creator of alchemy in the mythological tradition, and so it seems like this is an idea he keeps coming back to. And so when we look at how Jung specifically, where he ended up landing with alchemy and alchemic symbolism, is it sort of mirrors the inside processes of human beings in our own journeys of individuation, in that we have all these experiences and all these influences that come together, and much like the idea of lead transmuting to gold, all of these inner experiences come together to produce an entirely new product, an entirely new subject, an entirely new element, which I think is what we're also seeing with a lot of Burton's work, in that we're seeing all these influences and taking colors that were important to him and taking ideas that were important to him. And all of those things are being mixed together in this large cauldron that then produces something completely new, different, and fresh. It's that alchemical tradition at work in the art that we're seeing here.
And he definitely, he told me that alchemy is a very important part of an artist's life, partly because a lot of what the early alchemists were doing were blending colors,
Right.
inventing paints. What can we make? What can we use that will give us a color that will last? And also,
that you can reproduce. Exactly.
Right. So the lapis lazuli is always going to be the same shade of blue. And also, he believed that, therefore, or within all of this, that the artist was the ultimate alchemist, taking paint and turning it into gold.
Yeah.
And
that was what that meant.
Oof. So good, Nancy. So good.
I'm just repeating Bert.
I just want to interject
Please,
one very short thing. Alchemy is fascinating. There was a great show at the Getty called The Art of Alchemy. If you missed it, there is a catalog by the curator David Braffman that's worth a look. But two very, very important figures in contemporary culture and advancement spent the majority of their life actually studying alchemy. One was, of course, I'm blanking now. Who we were just speaking about? Jung.
Okay.
Wow. I went to my special place there for a moment. So one was Jung. He spent the last part of his life completely devoted, almost exclusively, if I'm correct,
Right.
in studying alchemy. The other is Sir Isaac Newton.
Yeah.
After he published the Principia, which established classical physics, he spent the rest of his life, and that's why that Blake painting of him is so important, because it's touching on that alchemical thing. Sorry, that was the worst quick interjection
No,
ever.
that's I think you just made a wonderful point, which is that alchemy is messy. Alchemy is it's sort of dirty. It makes a mess, right? When we go through these alchemical processes, and that leads me to slide 20, because I think we see the struggle of the alchemical process of the artist. We see the struggle of the alchemical process of being an outsider to contemporary thought, just like we saw with Bruno, being someone who's eventually burnt at the stake because his ideas are outside of the mainstream.
And who also traveled from place to place,
Yes.
getting kicked out of, giving his spiel and being lauded and then told, oh, get out of here, again and again and again.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
No, I think one of the things that strikes me about the body of his work is this fluctuation back between deep struggle, and then there's a celebratory nature, especially with the colors of a lot of the work, that I find him, as any human does in their journey, going back and forth between deep struggle and conflict and joy and celebration. And so I think we see that happening, here with deep struggle, but also with so many of the work that seems to embody this really wondrous joy.
And this piece in particular, I've put up a slide that doesn't have the title on it yet, because I think it just changes with every little bit of information that you get. So if you haven't, just pretend, and to our Zoomers out there too, pretend you haven't seen it with the title in the gallery yet, and just kind of think about what it might mean to you, just as an image. But then when we look at the title, we see that he's called it Yellow Figure Descending. And so that might change what it means to us a little bit. But then knowing that Burton was so interested in alchemy, and again, thank you, Kelly Carmina, who...
It's always thank you, Kelly Carmina. If you want to know anything, ask Kelly Carmina.
Oh, yellow, that's citronitas, which is, in alchemical terms, a term for yellow. And the sun and the light of the sun and the light that is within us all. So then we know that, and also that Jung, who Bert also studied intensely, thought of yellow as a symbol for the old man and the old woman. And knowing those things about Kopelow's background, we look at the piece again and we go, this piece has changed for me again. So then I'm going to share a story of Bert told me why he painted this piece. And I don't know that he wanted me to share it because, again, he wanted the art to be the conversation. But just to show you how things change again, he said, this is a painting that I did about the moment when my father passed away in the hospital and the two orderlies came and took his empty shell, his body, and put it into a body bag. So then we look at it again, and it means something else. And I've had people say that they thought this was a tender moment, other people who thought it was something a little more tense. And we bring so much to what we view, and it changes every time we see it. And that's why we go to museums and go to that same painting again and again, because we're different when we see it. Yeah. And it's why we want art in our homes, because it makes us happy, it makes us sad, it informs our day.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, the yellow figure descending. Hearing that story, we think about the image we usually have when someone passes from this plane to another is ascension. And I love that it's called Yellow Figure Descending, because that's so mythological. The idea of the descent is such a strong mythological idea, whether it's the descent of Persephone into the underworld, or the idea of divine ideas coming down to the earth, or the esoteric saying of as above, so below. This idea of descent is so mythological, and yet it looks like, hearing that story, there's this idea of ascent and descent both happening at the same time.
There's also a struggle going on in my mind, and it made me think a little bit of the Greeks, where they would periodically dip down into the underworld to sort of regroup and come back. I was thinking of Ulysses going to talk to, Achilles before he pops back up, and there's something about that too, like not going gracefully. Yeah. Or it's just the worst studio visit ever.
Yeah. I really appreciate earlier, Nancy, you mentioned one of the pieces was a very small piece. This piece is not a small piece. If you go in the gallery, it's very sizable piece.
It's 48 by 57.
Yeah, yeah.
So immediately to your left upon entering again.
Actually, if you haven't seen the work in real life, like any painting, you have to see it in real life. Yeah. It's a whole different experience. Actually, I'm wondering, there's one that I would love to talk about, and I'd love to get your take on it, because Lord knows I have one, which is frame 3, actually. So I'm just going to dive in, and then
Please.
But for me, my first take on this piece is really a formal one. And one of the things about Cubism that I really admired, one of the things about, Picasso, is the idea of trying to show many different perspectives at once. And this is really one of those that does that in spades. And what's weird about it is, or uncanny about it, is when you look at it, there are multiple perspectives at once, and yet formally it completely holds true. So it holds true to itself, it holds true to perspective number 1, perspective number 2, perspective number 3, and so on. And you can find different logics within the same work. And to me, one of the things about PRS that I love, one of the things about Jung that I love, one of the things about Joseph Campbell that I love, is the idea, I'm going to use that cliche, but of looking at things through different lenses. When you look at it through a Mayan lens, you can see it one way. When you look at it, through a Zoroastrian lens, it's another. When you look at it through an alchemical lens, it's yet another. And the idea of being able to view the world from a different viewpoint is obviously, any artist is excited about that. And I'm going to use that as a jumping off point to somebody who really knows this stuff.
No, I'm also struck by this piece. And honestly, there are two lenses that immediately come up for me with this piece. One lens is a lens that embodies the indigenous people of this country, the Native Americans of this country. There's something the energy there feels like what I've experienced in different Navajo art. It also feels like Joseph Campbell did a project with Maud Oaks where they took Navajo sand paintings.
Oh, yeah.
And he examined those. And there's something about this image that I feel like the energy is very similar there. But I'll tell you, the other piece that comes up for me, I feel like this is a lost George Clinton in Parliament Funkadelic album cover. I just feel like you could have easily put George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic their name on there, and I would have said, yeah, this is their new album.
It kind of looks like a Funkadelic record sounds. It's true.
It does. There's something about it that I think Afrofuturism comes through,
totally.
Which is the marrying of the ancient and the future, which we've talked about is something that Burt seemed to really be fascinated by, maybe not on a conscious level, but his subconscious seemed to keep wanting to dance between the ancient past and the distant future.
And there's that tradition in LA. There's the Afrofuturist. I mean, there's so many different, it's continued today by Kamasi Washington and musicians. Speaking of Philadelphia, there was Sun Ra. And then, another artist that's shown here, Benjamin Lauder, talks about Rammellzee and Coolcore. And there was just a retrospective of Rammellzee at Jeffrey Deitch just a year ago. The Afrofuturist thing is really on the money. Yeah. And it's striking to me also when you were talking about the Navajo work, I was really struck. I saw that stuff when I was a kid. It kind of went in one eye and out the other. And then I'm here and I'm studying all these European traditions, as well as Eastern. And then I started looking at Navajo work again, and I was really stunned at how sophisticated it was.
Yes.
It's both formally and mythologically. But it's like there's these pure little points that get deeper and deeper. Yeah.
Joseph Campbell never got over it. That
incredible.
Remained his go-to, artistic fascination. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Jung that's when he began to realize, the mandala's in every culture.
Right.
Because he was looking at Native Americans going like, wait a minute. Yeah. That's the thing with mandalas. As you well know, but Jung found examples of them in every culture he studied.
Culture, yeah. Nancy, what comes up for you with this image?
Well, and I think your points about it looks like he's somebody who looked at everything and studied everything very closely, and he did. Absolutely, absolutely. He always said that he learned composition from looking at the old masters, and he spent time, in the American Midwest. Sure, he knew Navajo art, anything that he could get his eyes on, basically. He loved to go to flea markets. Just to be able to look at stuff was just his joy. And not just that, but your idea that whether it was conscious or subconscious, I think it was quite conscious, especially when you start looking at the arc of the work, especially the earlier pieces, like the hands. It's a lot more overt, those symbolisms. The mandala of the Christ figure, they become less overt as time goes on, as he brings it more internal. But even, like the yellow figure descending, it's all there. It's a much later piece. But it's very consciously in all the work. It just becomes more his.
I wonder if we can move to slide 20.
That was.
I'm
just
impressed
where
you're
we
not
came
even
from.
looking at your cheat sheet. You just know this.
Do we want to see it again?
I
okay.
wanted to say
Sure.
one last thing about it just before we moved back to one other piece. One of the things that I failed to mention, before here, is we've talked a bit about his use of color and the way that certain colors are really bright and celebratory, and certain colors, are meant to evoke certain movements in art and certain mythological traditions. One of the things, though, that really I wanted to say about this piece is his use of yellow here is a different shade of yellow than I normally would think we would see. It's not a sunflower yellow. It's almost sort of a jaundiced type yellow. So I just wanted to thank you again for sharing that story. We're going to believe that Burt would have been okay with the sharing of that story, but that story made this piece even more rich to me, because that yellow really does feel like a sort of jaundiced type yellow. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Bert.
Yes, thank you, Bert. Yeah. I again want to get to as many pieces as possible. So yeah, 34 is so. I had to get at least one explicit mythological piece in here. We've got a number of pieces, though, that we could show that have a similar image where it feels like beast and man have been co-joined in some way, in the same way that much of mythology also is fascinated by these ideas of the combining of human beings and animals. With this particular piece, I'm challenged by it. It makes me a bit uncomfortable, because there's something here that is very friendly in the face of the beast, and yet I'm also scared. I'm also frightened by, the energy that is communicated there. There's been a number of psychologists, that have mythological interests that say oftentimes these mythological images that combine the beast with human beings are meant to evoke sort of the dual nature of human beings, that we have evolved from these animals, and we still have these very animal instincts inside of us, and yet we also have become more sophisticated in our development as human beings, that we don't just act on every animal instinct. And so that tension between our animal instincts and our very human evolved instincts often are what these images are meant to symbolize. But I'm curious for the two of you, what comes up with an image like this for the two of you? Nancy, what comes up for you?
Well, I've been looking at it more closely. This image is not, unfortunately, wasn't space for it in the show, but it is in the book, which is available at the bookstore.
Exit through the gift shop.
And looking at it more closely, it is pretty disturbing, especially when you consider that there's a human head in the basket.
Right.
And then if you know his body of work, the human head seems to be his partner of the time. So it's like, And there were days when I would come home and Bert would have something on the easel and he would always say, "What do you think of what's on the easel?" And one time I came home and there was something that disturbed me a little bit, and I thought, is he sort of afraid or frightened or depressed? And I went to him and I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm fine." He put it all on the canvas. So, and who knows if he was referring to something personal or something mythological or just expressing a moment or just expressing a story. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, we kind of have a Van Gogh Starry Night thing going, up above. And
peaceful in some way.
It is, yeah. David, how about you? What comes up for you?
Nothing relaxes me more than a good beheading, I gotta say. So I'm getting that peaceful feeling too. I was going to joke earlier, what does this painting say to me? It says, "Don't go out at night." But the other thing, though, in terms of this conversation is, it's amazing, it's uncanny to me also in how many different cultures half man, half beast appear. Like a quick shorthand, if you think of Ganesh and the Minotaur, there's,
Oh, keep
well,
going.
she's going to find a backup for that. It's incredible that that's also something that continually emerges or, pops up.
So this piece is in the show, and there's another beast-human conjunction, which is also a little bit fun, but a little bit disturbing.
Well, and I'll tell you, one of the things that struck me about the way that he would incorporate humans and beasts is oftentimes mythologically, it would be the lower half that would be an animal. So we think of like the centaur, right?
Right.
But his work, it's usually the head that is an animal and the body is somewhat human. Now in this particular work, also the legs become, an animal as well. But I think that's a really interesting idea of playing with that idea because, again, the Greeks were likely, or the interpretation of that centaur image is that, yes, we have these very animal instincts and our bodies are animals, but now we have these large brains that we can't just act on every animal instinct, so the head would be human. But here we have sort of, in both of these images, a reversal of that idea that it's the head that has the animal instincts and the body has become very human. So I think it's a really, it plays with that idea, that we might expect in these images.
This form also reminds me of the chicken dog from Poor Things. I don't know if you guys saw that film.
Yeah. Really interesting. Well, in the interest of time, there's one or two other images I want to make sure that we get to, and I again am going to invite everyone to please come over to the gallery after our conversation, and Nancy and David will be happy to answer all your deep questions, and I'll stand there and look at the art and enjoy. But they are going to be happy to answer the questions you have. But I did want to make sure that we got to another one of these images that really just sort of punched me in the gut when I saw it. And this is image 59. Mm-hmm. This, I still, even seeing it, I'm moved by it. It has a very visceral, I find myself having a very visceral reaction to this particular piece. And I looked at the piece probably a dozen times before I looked at the title, because as you said, the title really does change things a bit. But when I looked at the title, it actually made the piece feel more rich to me, Cosmic Glory, because to me, this is, I mentioned some pieces felt very celebratory to me. And there's something that's very celebratory, almost like confetti going off everywhere. But also, there's the cosmic chaos at work here. And I feel like there's something in the energy of this piece, for me at least, that combines chaos and celebration, that we can hold both of those things, one thing in each hand, and have an experience that is both terrifying and full of wonder, all in the same moment. So what about the two of you? What comes up for you?
Well, hard agree on what you just said, absolutely. The other thing I would just point out very quickly is that this obviously, you can see a direct line from the piece I had shown earlier and this with the multiple perspectives at once. But really the thing that strikes me the most about this piece, and this work from this period became my gateway into the world of Burton Kopelow, is if you saw this painted on a wall in Silver Lake right now, you would think that a kid had done it last week. Yeah. I mean, and this was done when? 83. So, I mean, 41 years ago, right? So, I mean, it's incredible how prescient some of this later work is. And I almost feel as if, all the other work was building to this. Mm-hmm. And it's not, that doesn't mean to ignore the other work, but, I showed a different mandala of his from this period in a contemporary show called The Unified Field, and every other artist in the show was practicing now. Mm-hmm. And that work looked the most contemporary. Yeah. Yeah. It looked like it had been done yesterday.
It's incredible.
It is incredible.
Yeah.
And it's actually incredibly sophisticated as well. For a work that's a lot of different perspectives going on at once with a lot of flat color, you're getting an enormous amount of dimension out of it, and you're also, it hangs. And what I mean by that is, I work a lot with symmetry, and part of the reason I work with symmetry is, God damn it, if there's two of something, now it's a pattern and it makes sense. It's like the Charlie Parker thing. If you hit a wrong note, hit it again, then they think you meant it. And so this has the form of symmetry and the balance of it with absolutely no symmetry in it whatsoever.
It's visual jazz.
It
just
is.
the Charlie Parker.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What about you, Nancy? What comes up for you there?
What this piece is sort of the end of a story and the beginning of a story at the same time. Kopelow, he had this period where he was exploring and becoming an artist, and some of the pieces that we've been talking about are more from that period. And he became very interested in mandalas. These were Giordano Bruno's, which were in his book, and then Jung. This is one of Jung's that he would have seen, and of course the ones that he would have seen at PRS. And he became so interested in the mandala that he wrote. He was living in Sacramento at the time, 1972. He came to Los Angeles, tried to meet with him, left a note saying, I really want to do a book on mandalas, and will you give me access so that I can do this? And Manly Hall wrote a lovely note back saying, going to do my own book, thanks for your interest, maybe after it gets published. And Bert, within that same moment, whether it was before that trip or after that trip, a result of preparing for the trip or what, he did this little piece. And it's the first of his sort of modern mandalas, where things are starting to come together for him. And he'd been working fairly, that would have been a large piece for him at that time. And not long after he found out that this wasn't going to happen, a friend came by the house with an opaque projector. So it's a projector where you can put something that's opaque and it'll project it on the wall. And he took this little piece and he showed him what it would look like the size of a wall. That big. I measured it the other day, so it really 81 inches. Excuse me. Oh, it's important. And that changed everything for him. The idea of these new sort of shapes, bringing all of those things together into himself and then making them that large. So he started on a journey of 24 huge canvases that he called chromorphism. And that piece, Cosmic Glory, is one of them. And the pieces start with these mandalas that change and grow and then explode.
Wow.
I love that piece.
Yes. So
And then they become sort of figures on landscapes. Still this and the titles. This one, Denizens of the Crystal Forest. So they're still giving you this reference to hang on to. And then the last pieces are just entirely abstract.
Yeah.
And so there are these 24 huge canvases that he meant for people to see together and in a certain order so that you would have exited the exhibit absolutely transformed. That was his idea.
Wow. Well, we were supposed to wrap at 5, and we're staring down 5:30 right now. So let's do one last piece before we go over to the gallery. And again, be happy to have conversation or answer questions in the gallery. But Nancy, I wonder if you might do us the honor of selecting one last piece that you'd like for us to
no pressure.
consider.
Oh,
No
my
pressure.
goodness. I think that kind of was my one last piece.
Well, I'm happy to suggest one
Please
more
do.
myself, if that's okay, because I had a number that we didn't get to. This I love this whole series here, but let's go to 31. There is a piece that feels like it is a cousin of this piece in the show that I wonder a lot about the mythic ideas that were going through his mind when he was creating what appears to be, to me, several images around this mythic idea. We see one individual carrying an individual, but in the individual being carried, there's this sort of wise old man archetype that seems to be at the center. There is a strange embodiment that's being carried. And for me, as I see it, and as I see the other pieces that were very much in the family of this piece that he did, I'm reminded of the burden of the artist, that he carried these ideas around him with him every day. And as you mentioned, he did not show his work in big shows. And where a lot of artists, as David mentioned, get that conversation of the work getting to be out there and put in front of people and having that conversation, Burton seemed to carry all this himself. And I think carrying the art, feeling sometimes like you are this outsider, like you are this loner, it comes through in this series in a very profound way to me. And I feel very empathetic towards the artist as I engage that piece. But what comes up for the two of you?
Well, I certainly see that. And Burton said to me once that he thought all artists were brave because you're putting it out there for people to make whatever comment they will or won't. And this piece is fairly early, 1960s likely. And as he developed his practice, which he did every day, and was just known by all his colleagues as the guy that I wish I could be that dedicated. I wish I would not let the other things get in the way. I wish I would stand in front of the easel every day, no matter what. And I think towards the end of his life, especially after he had that first show, he had just become so comfortable with it that I think he felt a lot freer about how he dealt with the paint and the canvas, and he just, you see this switching from styles in the beginning, but in the end, he was switching styles every day, twice a day, just whatever piece, whatever came into his head, he was putting it onto the canvas. And so certainly, I'm sure there were days like that, but I think they became fewer as he sort of became the artist, the hero of our journey, the hero of his own journey.
He's brought the boon back to us today. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
David, how about you?
I definitely get the outsider thing from it, and I think, something we didn't touch on, and we had talked about in the previous talk, is that Burton was always movement adjacent. And by that I mean he was in New York in the 50s when abstract expressionism was kicking into gear. He was in LA in the 60s when the Ferris Gallery was beginning to become a force to be reckoned with. And he hung out with those artists. He knew them. He went to Cedar. He went to Barney's Beanery. He fraternized with these folks. He knew who they were. They knew who he was. And yet, wasn't showing. That to me is incredible, because you could imagine that somebody might be off in their own little world with their nose in a book and continually refining work on their own, but he was watching people have huge success. And there was one story that I'd heard about the artist at Ferris, and it almost makes me want to believe that Burton had overheard it. No proof of this whatsoever. But Billy L. Bankston was showing some of his work at Ferris, and Ed Ruscha said, "Why aren't you showing that other stuff?" And Billy L. was like, "They're not ready for that. Like this will sell." And I think if you start to think in those terms, you start to think, Robert Irwin always said, like, it's better if you don't make your living as an artist, because then you're not driven by the market. I know a lot of artists who would disagree with that or hope for it to be different. But that's one viewpoint. And the idea is that you keep your purity. And I think if Burton was aware of that, and it seems that in Ferris you would, because it was one of the first pop galleries, people were making work for that venue, as well as finding an outlet for things they'd already been doing. He may have been thinking, like, I want no part of that. I'm still figuring it out. Just a pet theory of mine.
Well, certainly he was aware of how artists were very aware of all of that, and didn't care. He was going to do what he was going to do, no matter what anybody. And so I'm sure gallery directors found that charming.
Would you join me in thanking Nancy and David and Burton Kopelow for his work?
And John Bucher.